Good evening. I told Mary a few minutes ago, she said they got plenty of rain to water their garden. I told her, well, now that it's rained on the unjust, the next time it'll rain on the just. We didn't get a drop. You know that hymn that Joe started with a few moments ago, 223. I didn't ask Joe to lead that song, but it is a very good introduction to what we're going to do tonight. Swiftly, the hours are passing away, and swiftly we're reaching the end of our earthly existence. One of the things that people say are two things that you can count on, and one is taxes, and you remember the other one is death. And we do our very best as human beings to stop death sometimes, but it's going to happen to all of us if the Lord doesn't return first. And I've sat by the bedside of a number of people in my lifetime that have passed away. And as you sit there, perhaps holding their hand or actually talking to them, they breathe their last. And we know what happens to the body after that. Nobody needs to be told that. But as they pass away, we wonder, where are they going? What's happening to them? Do they know that they've passed from this life? And there are dozens of other questions. Tonight I want to cover this subject to the best of my ability. And we're going to deal with some words. And I'm going to ask you to look at some scriptures in a few minutes. If you want to look up these other things, you can do so later. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew. And the first time it was translated in any significant passages was into Greek. And it was translated from Hebrew into Greek about 300 years before Christ came to this earth. That translation is still in existence today. So if you want to translate the Greek Old Testament into English today, you use that translation. So it's 300 years approximately before the coming of Christ. The Septuagint was the translation into Greek. There's a word in the Old Testament, and you can find that word very easily. I think it's used 65 times in the Old Testament. The word is Sheol. That's spelled S-H-E-O-L. That's is found in the original Hebrew Bible. When they translated it into Greek, there was a word in Greek that represented Sheol in Hebrew, and it was Hades. So in the New Testament Greek, 11 times you will find the word Hades. Okay, we've gone from Hebrew to Greek. Now let's go to English. When it was translated into English, there was no English word that represented the same thing. So they simply translated it into English, or lack of it rather, Hades. When the King James translation came in 1611, they decided to anglicize the word, and they translated it hell. Okay? Now, I'll read you some passages where that word is used. So let's go back now. Sheol, Hades, and anglicize it to hell. What does it mean? There is no question about what it means, because every Hebrew scholar and every Greek scholar say that, and the translation is generally rendered this: the place where disembodied souls go. Disembodied is a word I don't use every day. It means where our bodies have been separated from our souls. We know where our bodies go. Where do the souls go? They go to Sheol, or they go to Hades in Greek, and oftentimes people say, well, they went to hell. Through the years, the last 2,000 years, the word hell has come to mean the place of punishment. But that's not the original meaning of the word Hades. The Hades are where the dead go. In the American Standard Translation, they go back to the original word Hades. Now, you might have a translation that uses the word Hades, and if I am correct, most translations into English now use the word Hades, because when we use the word hell, that's come to us meaning something else. Now, I want us to look at some passages of Scripture. I want you to turn to Acts chapter 2. Now, before we do some reading there, let me tell you some more about the word Sheol and the word Hades. They were places where the dead go, not the bodies, the spirit. And in Hades, or in Sheol, there were always considered in Hebrew and Greek two divisions: a place of comfort, a reward, and a place of punishment. Now, with that in mind, let's go to, well, I told you Acts chapter 2. I guess we can start there. It's really difficult to know where to start. We have a lot of information, but we'll go to Acts chapter 2. After Christ died, remember, he was resurrected from the dead. Then, about 40 days later, he ascended up into heaven. Okay? After that, we had the Holy Spirit descend upon the apostles in Jerusalem. And when the initial events happened, Peter stood up and preached a sermon. It's in Acts chapter 2. I'm not here to read the sermon to you, but I do want to read part of it. What Peter said was that he was trying to convince his audience that Jesus was the Christ. Now, let's start in verse 25 and just read a few verses of what Peter says. Peter refers to David's writing in the Old Testament. For David speaketh concerning him, that is Christ. And this is the quote from Psalm 16. I foresaw the Lord always before my face, for he is on my right hand, that I should not be moved. Therefore did my heart rejoice, and my tongue was glad. Moreover, also my flesh shall rest in hope. Now look in verse 25. I don't know what you have in terms of translation. I'm reading from the Old King James. And the reason for that is that's what I grew up with. I'm too old a dog to learn new tricks. Notice verse 27. because thou wilt not leave my soul in hell. Who are we talking about? Jesus. When he died on that cross about 40 days earlier, Peter's quoting from David in the Old Testament, thou wilt not leave my soul in hell. Now this is the King James translation. Probably you have a translation that says, will not leave my soul in Hades, right? Will not suffer thy Holy One to see corruption. Where did Jesus go when he died? For those 3 days. He went into the Hadean world, or Hades. Now, move down to verse 31. Same sermon, same subject. He, seeing before this, talking about David, spake of the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in hell, neither his flesh did see corruption. When Christ died, for those days of his death, where was his body? It was in that tomb. Where was his spirit? In Hades, the place of the dead. Now, for lack of time, let's go back to the book of Luke. Chapter 23, and I'm not going to read it. I just don't have the time. In Luke chapter 23, there is an account of the death of Jesus. You can read it again, and I suggest that you do. Jesus was nailed to a cross, and on each side of him were crosses. On those crosses were convicts who had been convicted of whatever the crimes. One of them began to belittle Jesus and said, well, if you are the Christ, then come down off that cross and bring us with you. The other thief stopped that conversation and said, you need, in other words, I'm going to paraphrase, you need to be respectful, because this man is dying and he's innocent. We're guilty. And then he said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Now, do you remember the reply of Jesus? Today, that is the day that Christ is hanging on that cross, and he's going to die that day. Today thou shalt be with me in paradise. There we have another word. Where did Jesus go that day? He went to the Hadean world. Where did he go in the Hadean world? To the paradise part. Now, on that third day, Jesus rose from the dead. What happened? His spirit was reunited with his body. What body was it? It was the very body that was buried. Because later on a Sunday night, when they were having worship, Thomas skipped it that Sunday night and wasn't there. And they said, the Lord appeared to us. The next Sunday night, I guarantee you, Thomas was going to be there, and he was. And the Lord appeared again unto them, and Thomas still wasn't quite convinced that was Jesus. He was looking, but the Lord said, "Oh, you want to see the hole in my side? Stick your hand in it." Thomas said, "No, Lord, I believe." So the spirit of Jesus, which had been in Hades, had been reunited with his physical body. Remember what we just read in Acts chapter 2? His flesh did not see corruption. Now, if you've had as much contact with undertakers as I've had, I count some undertakers as some good friends of mine. Most folks don't do that. They'll tell you the body begins to decay almost immediately, and something has to be done. It has to be either refrigerated or embalmed. Jesus' body was not embalmed by modern standards, but his spirit was reunited. But where was Jesus during that time? In Hades. Now, I want us to turn over to Luke chapter 16, and we are going to take the time here to read this. It's a very familiar story, and I want to emphasize strongly, we're not talking about a parable. Every time Jesus told a parable, he introduced it by saying, or the writer said, it's a parable. But look in Luke chapter 16, chapter 16, we're going to begin in verse 19. Jesus, and these are his words, there was a certain rich man, which was clothed in purple and fine linen, and fared sumptuously every day. And there was a certain beggar, Lazarus, which was laid at his gate, full of sores. Now let me stop right here and make sure we are on the same page. Lazarus is a rich man. Well, I'll get it right in a minute. There's a rich man, and then there's Lazarus, who's the beggar, and they have contact on earth. You with me? Where was Lazarus laid? At the rich man's door. And he was full of sores, that is Lazarus, and desiring to be fed the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. Verse 22, and it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by angels into Abraham's bosom. We're going to come back to that in a minute. The rich man also died, and they buried him. Notice that this poor beggar was a righteous man, and when he died, the angels carried what? His body? Carried his spirit into the next world, the Hadean world. Verse 23, King James Version again renders it, and in hell. Hades would be more appropriate in our language today. And in Hades, the rich man lifted up his eyes, being in torment. Now, we had two men die. I don't know if they died the same day or not. That's not the point. The point is that here's a rich man who was not righteous, a poor beggar who was righteous. They both died. They both went to Hades. But where did the rich man go? He was in a place of torment. Where did Lazarus go? He went into Abraham's bosom. Now, folks, I think everybody in this room has enough Bible knowledge to know that Abraham is always referred to as the father of the faithful. And Abraham is one of the most blessed men in terms of God's relationship with him that ever existed on the face of this earth. Abraham went to the place of comfort. Where did the beggar go? He went right into Abraham's bosom. Bosom doesn't mean his chest. It simply means where Abraham is. Where did this ungodly rich man go? All it says is he died and he went to a place of torment. Now let's go on and read some more. And in Hades, he lifted up his eyes, being in torments, the rich man, and he seeth Abraham afar off. Here's something very significant. This rich man had never seen Abraham. He'd never seen Abraham. But he recognized the spirit of Abraham. Now, I can't tell you why or how that's possible. But he recognized Abraham. And who else did he recognize in that verse? He recognized Lazarus. He'd seen him, but he'd not seen Abraham. Notice Lazarus and Abraham are in the same place. They're both in Hades, or the place of the dead. And the rich man cried, and he said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. Well, the rich man's not in a very good place, but he's in the place of the dead. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime received thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things, but now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. Two different places, two different things happening. One place, those that are dead are being comforted. The other place, the dead are being tormented. And Abraham goes on, verse 26. And beside all this, between us and you, there's a great gulf fixed, so that they which could pass from hence to you cannot, and neither can they pass to us that would come from thence. Now, I know this is a little difficult to picture. Here is the place of the dead, the Hadean world. There are two parts. Those on either side are able to recognize those on the other side. But there is no passing between the two. But there is recognition. Then he said, I pray thee therefore, Father, that thou wouldst send him to my father's house. That is, Abraham, do something. Send Lazarus back to the living. I've got 5 brothers, he says, and I don't want them to come here. Now, let's stop right there. Often the question is asked, in the place of the dead, whoever they might be, the righteous or the unrighteous, the godly or the ungodly, do they recognize this story told by Jesus, who he himself was just a few weeks away from this, was going to die, and he was going to go there? Said they recognized each other. At least the rich man recognized Lazarus. And he recognized Abraham, whom he'd never seen. We're talking about spirits, not bodies. So, yes, the answer is there's recognition in Hades. Okay? Then the next significant thing is when he asked Abraham to send Lazarus back to this earth to tell his brothers, don't come to here, I want Lazarus to go to my father's house. He knows where he lives. I got 5 brothers there. Tell him to walk in the door and tell my 5 brothers don't go where their old brother went. And the Lord, through this story, said that wouldn't do any good. They wouldn't believe him if he came back from the dead. But notice what Abraham said to this rich man. He said, remember what you were living or how you were living back on this earth? Remember? He's rich. He's got everything. Hold it. That man remembered. He remembered how he lived. He remembered his brothers. He knew their names. He knew what he'd done, or not done, as the case might be. Now, what does this story about two men, one of them nameless, what do we learn? Both died. Their spirits went into the Hadean world, but they didn't go into the same part. Now let's go back to Jesus on the cross. On the cross, Jesus said to the thief, "Today thou shalt be with me in paradise." When Christ died, he went to that part of the Hadean world that could be labeled paradise. It's also, in this account, a place of comfort. Paradise, place of comfort. Now, Jesus did not ascend to the Father during those 3 days. How do I know that? Paradise is not where God is. Because Jesus, after his resurrection, said, "I have not ascended yet to the Father." So for 3 days, Jesus was in the place of the dead. Now let's stop right there. Make an important point here. Jesus came to this earth to experience everything we experience, right? In other words, he came to experience how it feels to live in a body. Now, he didn't need to do that because he's part of God and he could have known, but he wanted to do that in order to say to us, "I've experienced what you've experienced." So he experienced living in a body. He experienced being tired and hungry and thirsty and all of the things that we deal with. Then he experienced death, right? Just like we're going to. Then he had to experience one more thing in order to experience everything we're going to experience. He had to die and go to the Hadean world. But God didn't keep him there, did he? He raised him from the dead. And then he ascended to the Father in what form? In bodily form. So Christ went to the place of the dead. He experienced that. And you and I haven't done that yet. Now, there are so many other things that we need to read and say, but we'd be here another half hour at least. So let's look at basically what we've learned. First of all, we learned that it is appointed unto man once to die. We're going to die. Somebody told me this morning after service, they said when they die, they hope they die in their sleep. Well, you know something? You don't get your choice. We're going to die. Maybe a very quiet death in sleep, maybe a very violent death. We're going to die. There's no escape. Secondly, we learn that at death, our body goes back to the dust from which it came. We didn't quote those scriptures, you know them. And we're very conscious of that fact because we've seen it done. Then our spirit goes into the Hadean world. And the Hadean world does not necessarily mean punishment. You know how words in the English language take on different meanings? When I was born, somebody would say to my parents, I'd hear my grandmother say it especially, "Oh, they're a very gay person, aren't they?" But that's not what that word means today. So the word Hades, and I've often heard people use it incorrectly. You know, he went to Hades, as if everybody else doesn't. When we die, our spirit goes into the Hadean world. And if you look into the Greek language, if you want to look up the definition of Hades in the Greek language, it will simply tell you it's the place of the dead. Hades. Pardon? Okay, well, I'll get to you. We're in the Hadean world, and there are two parts to it. A place of comfort and a place of torment. And who makes the decision where we go? Well, to a certain extent, it's God, but in a greater extent, it's us. Who's going to go to the Hadean world? This righteous beggar? This great man of faith? Where did the Lord go? Did he go into the place of torment? No. He went into paradise, and the thief on the cross went with him because of his faith in Christ. Two parts: torment, paradise, or comfort. Now, to Alice's question, how long do they stay there? Well, first of all, we need to understand that when we leave this world, there's something else we leave behind besides our body and our possessions. What do we leave behind? Time. There's not a one of us in this room, even McKinley back here, can't imagine not living with time, right? It's going to be time to go to bed here pretty soon. You know, it's time to eat, or it's time to go to work. But we leave time behind. There is no time in the Hadean world. So you ask the question, how long? There it is, time. It doesn't exist there. When the Hadean world, now somebody asked this question. Bear with me, okay? Somebody asked this question. Well, that's heaven and hell, right? No, that's the Hadean world, the place of the dead. Are there communications between those two worlds in Hades? It was here, right? You know, there's a resurrection of the dead. And on what day is the resurrection of the dead? Well, we don't know, because that's the day Christ comes back. By the way, it doesn't say in Scripture that Christ is coming back to this earth in the sense he's going to land out here in the hayfield. He said, I'll meet them in the air, remember? But he's coming back to this world, not the physical world. Then there's going to be the judgment day. Now, the question often asked of me is, well, if we're separated at death into the Hadean world, why is there a judgment day? You know the answer that Jesus gave? The answer is that day's coming when we have to give an account of the deeds done in our body. And that's why we call it the judgment day. Think about it this way. Walter goes out there and commits a crime tonight. And they find him with the bloody knife in his hand. He's going to go to the Richland County Jail tonight, right? Has he been sentenced? He's not going to be sentenced to punishment until when? Until there's a trial and a judgment. Here are individuals divided. Did the rich man know why he was there? By the way, it's also interesting, I didn't point this out. The rich man didn't complain about being there. In other words, I'm an innocent man. I'm here in the wrong place. He didn't like it, but he knew why he was there. So the judgment is when we have to give an account of the deeds, the things we've done while living on this earth. Then the great judge is going to say, read it in Matthew, Jesus talked about it. After that judgment has been heard, then the great judge, by the way, who is Christ, is going to say to those here on his left hand, depart from me, ye workers of iniquity, for I know you not. And they're going to go off into eternal punishment. To the righteous, enter in to the world that I prepared for you. Now, in short, Luke 16 tells us that there's recognition in Hades. And immediately people say, you know, I looked over on the other side and I saw somebody I love and they're not on my side. I can't live that way. And I don't have the answer for that. It's simply this, that Lazarus was comforted. Now, we're talking about the spirit world. And here's a man looking over there, or a woman, it doesn't make any difference. And they say they're marriage mates over there. How does that work? I don't know how that works. But I know that there's a separation. And I know that according to this, there's recognition. Now, there is an account where Jesus was having a discussion with the Sadducees who don't believe in the place of the dead. They don't believe in angels. They don't believe in a resurrection. They don't believe in much of anything. And Jesus talked about marriage. And he says there is no marriage or given of marriage in where? Hades? Heaven. Hades is not heaven. Hades is reserved for the righteous when the righteous judge sends them there. So Walter with his crime is not going to go to prison or anywhere else, but he's being held in incarceration. Now, I've used all the time up, but anybody have a question that I could answer?